everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that I'm sure many of you are hearing more and more about. We're doing a deep dive on Autistic Demand Avoidance, or ADA.
It's one of those things that's really easy to misunderstand, especially because it often gets confused with other behavioral profiles.
Yeah.
So today we're really going to roll up our sleeves and try to get a clear picture of what ADA really is, what it looks like, and most importantly, how we can best support those who experience it.
Sounds good.
And to help us navigate this complex world, we have our amazing expert with us.
Hi, glad to be here.
So let's just jump right in. When we talk about autistic demand avoidance, what are we really talking about? Give us the lay of the land here.
So when we talk about autistic demand avoidance, we're talking about a behavioral profile that we often see in autistic individuals. And with this profile comes a really strong resistance to everyday demands and expectations. And this is where things get a little tricky because it's not about being, stubborn or defiant in the way that we typically think about it.
Right, it's not just a kid who doesn't want to do their chores.
Exactly. What we're talking about with ADA is really rooted in anxiety.
Okay, so anxiety is the real root of it. So it's more like, if you can imagine even everyday demands, like something that might seem small or insignificant to others, it can feel completely overwhelming for someone with ADA. It's like this wave that's about to crash over them.
That's a really good way to put it.
And ADA is that coping mechanism, that instinct to avoid that wave at all costs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's that intensity of the feeling that's key. And that's what leads to these behaviors that can be so easily misinterpreted.
Yeah, it's like fight or flight mode, but for just everyday life. And I think that's why it's so misunderstood. So we're talking about anxiety being that driving force. Now, our source breaks it down into 3 core characteristics of ADA. And the second one they mention is fluid behavior. But how can behavior be fluid if we're talking about avoidance? Shouldn't it be more like consistent?
Yeah, so that's where, needing a deeper understanding is important because with fluid behavior, we're not talking about, a constant, unwavering no to every single demand. Instead, that resistance, that avoidance, it fluctuates.
Interesting.
It kind of ebbs and flows based on, internal anxiety levels at any given moment.
So what might feel manageable one day could totally send them into a tailspin the next.
Exactly.
Wow, that must make things incredibly challenging for the individual and for everyone around them.
For sure.
And I imagine that unpredictability makes it harder to actually even get an accurate diagnosis.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've got anxiety as this like engine, this fluid, ever-changing response. And then the third characteristic our source talks about is social motivation. But isn't that a little counterintuitive? If you're avoiding demands, wouldn't social situations be part of that too?
Right, but here's the thing. People with ADA, like all of us, often do want to connect socially.
Of course.
But those interactions can also be huge sources of anxiety.
Right.
So the avoidance behaviors might actually be a way to navigate those situations more comfortably on their own terms.
So it's not that they dislike people. It's that they're trying to figure out how to interact in a way that feels safe.
Exactly.
Even if it means taking a step back or using approaches that the other people might not totally understand.
Exactly. And that feeds into why it's so important to really separate ADA from other things like, for example, Oppositional Defiant Disorder.
Right, because it's not just about labels. It's about understanding the why behind the behavior.
Exactly.
And that distinction, my friends, is what we're going to dig into next. Because getting this right, this is about so much more than just a diagnosis. This is about getting the right support for individuals with ADO. And that starts with understanding. So stay with us.
All right, so we're back and ready to dig into why understanding the difference between ADA and other conditions is so important. You mentioned Oppositional Defiant Disorder, ODD, and it seems like on the surface there might be some similarities. Like we see kids pushing back, not following directions. So help us understand why it's so important to get this right.
Yeah, you're right. There can be some similarities on the surface, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. But when we, peel back the layers a bit, we see how different those motivations actually are.
And our source material does a really good job of highlighting that. With ODD, a lot of times it's about challenging authority. It's that need to be in control.
Exactly. Yeah, it's often a very conscious choice. It's a power struggle almost. Whereas with ADA, remember, it always comes back to escaping anxiety. And a lot of times that's happening on a subconscious level. The individual may not even fully grasp why they're feeling that intense urge to resist, only that they have to.
Yeah, and there was this point in the source that really got me thinking. It said that kids with ODD may not feel bad after, defying someone, but those with ADA, they often feel guilty, distressed even, but they still struggle to act differently. It's like the anxiety is kind of calling the shots no matter how much they logically understand the situation.
That is such a critical insight, and it really highlights the emotional turmoil that can be going on beneath the surface, right?
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that we can't just address the behavior without thinking about the anxiety that is driving it.
Right. It's like we're speaking two entirely different languages.
Exactly.
And if we're reacting as if the individual is choosing to be defiant, then we're missing the entire point.
100%. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly.
It's not going to work. And not only that, it can make things worse, right?
Of course.
Imagine feeling that intense anxiety and then being met with anger or punishment. It just creates a vicious cycle.
Right, right. It's just going to amplify that anxiety for sure. Okay, so we're really starting to see how misinterpreting ADA can have some pretty big consequences, but let's shift gears a little bit now and talk about what we can do with this knowledge, because I know our listeners are like me. You hear this information and you think, okay, this is powerful, but how do I put it into practice? So how do we shift from that place of frustration to a place of understanding and support when it comes to ADA?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And thankfully, our source gives us some really, really practical advice here.
Hmm.
One of the biggest things I see is this theme of empowerment, finding ways to give individuals with ADA a sense of control in their environment, which can then help to reduce that anxiety.
So it's not about like surrendering all expectations or letting them run the show, but finding ways to meet those needs while still having boundaries.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. And one of the best ways to do that is through flexibility, offering choices instead of demands.
Right. So instead of you need to do your homework now, it's would you like to work on your homework now or would you prefer to take a 15-minute break first?
Exactly. You're giving that sense of ownership over the situation a chance to feel heard and respected.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be so powerful.
So powerful, yeah. Our source also talks about safe spaces, and
Mhm.
that's an area where we could all use a little more clarity. When we're talking about ADA, what does a safe space actually look like?
That's a great point. We often think of a safe space as, a physical space,
Mm.
and that's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
But it's important to broaden that understanding, right? A safe space for someone with ADA can be about communication styles, the emotional tone of interactions.
Interesting.
It's about creating an environment where they feel comfortable expressing their needs and knowing that those needs will be respected.
So it's not just about like having a designated calm down corner, although that can be helpful, but it's also about being mindful of our own energy, our tone of voice, even our body language.
100%. Remember, communication is so much more than just the words that we're saying. Our nonverbal cues, our facial expressions, our tone, all of it sends a really powerful message. And for someone with ADA, those nonverbal cues can either make their anxiety worse or help them to feel safe.
That's such a good point. I think we really underestimate how important those nonverbal cues are.
For sure.
Wow. And then finally, our source talks about the importance of problem solving together. And this is where we see that big difference between ADA and ODD.
That's
With ODD, it's a lot of power struggles. It's about one person winning. But with ADD, it's about collaboration, working with the individual to find solutions that work for them.
exactly.
You're cute.
Yeah. And by involving them in the process, we're not only teaching valuable problem-solving skills, but also building trust and respect.
That's so important.
Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it? That
Yeah.
one shift, just seeing ADA as a response and not a choice, it can totally change the whole dynamic.
It's like we were saying before, speaking the right language.
Totally. And using that language, understanding those little things, that's how we figure out how to respond with compassion instead of getting stuck in that place of frustrating,
Yeah.
you know?
And it's not just about warm, fuzzy feelings, although empathy is so important. It's also about, actually getting better outcomes for everybody involved. And our source really brings home this point, that when we misinterpret ADA as ODD, when we're seeing defiance instead of anxiety, it can actually lead us to use these interventions that backfire.
Oh, interesting.
And then instead of helping, they make the anxiety even worse. It's harder for the individual, harder for everybody around them. Just makes things so much more difficult.
It's a huge reminder that we can't just like slap a label on things and hope for the best, right?
Right.
A little knowledge without the right approach, and you're right, it can do more harm than good.
Exactly. Assessment is crucial, but it's really just the first step. And then from there, It's about that tailored support. It's about really understanding each individual, what their needs are, and then, meeting them in that collaborative way that we talked about.
Absolutely. Well, as we kind of start to wrap up our deep dive here, it seems like the main takeaway for our listeners, that big aha moment, is that recognizing ADA, it's about so much more than just knowing the definition, right?
Yeah,
It's about understanding that it's an anxiety response and not a behavioral choice.
100%.
And approaching it from that place of understanding, I mean, that's crucial for anyone who's interacting with someone who, shows these traits, parents, teachers, friends, or even someone who just, wants to be more informed, more empathetic. It really makes a difference.
It really does. That shift in thinking, it's often the key to, better communication, stronger relationships, and just an overall better sense of well-being for everyone.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to resurface from this deep dive. But remember, this isn't a one and done kind of thing. Understanding ADA, it's a journey. The things we've talked about today, those insights, they're just the starting point. So keep those questions coming, keep looking for information, and most importantly, just keep the conversation going.
Yeah, for sure.
A huge thank you to our incredible expert for guiding us through all of this. Your insights, as always, amazing.
Oh, of course. Happy to be here.
And to our awesome listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another exploration into the world around us. Until then, take care.